What happened next has been described many different ways in the retelling. Stephanie would later claim, "I maliciously destroyed her vehicle." Her insurance company would use phrases like deliberate collision and avoidable contact. What actually happened was this. I maneuvered the harvester as carefully as possible through the narrow opening between the barn door and Stephanie's Porsche. Despite my best efforts, there simply wasn't enough clearance. The harvester's wide wheel housing scraped along the driver's side of the Porsche, crumpling the door panel and shattering the side window. The horrible sound of metal on metal made my stomach clench, but I kept going, focused on the crops that needed saving more than the luxury car that was deliberately blocking my way. Once the harvester was clear of the barn, I immediately stopped and called the sheriff's office myself to report what had happened. Then I called Frank Wilson again to let him know. "Document everything," he repeated, "and get that crop in before the storm hits." With my neighbors still recording, I made a final statement on camera. I, Grant Thompson, just exercised my legal right to access my barn via the deeded easement on my property. I took this action only after exhausting all reasonable means to contact the vehicle owner and after providing written notice of my intent. The damage to the vehicle was unavoidable given the emergency situation with the approaching storm and potential crop loss. Only then did I head to the fields, racing against the darkening sky to salvage what I could of our summer vegetables. I was nearly finished with the north field when I saw the sheriff's cars coming up the drive, lights flashing. Behind them was Stephanie's Range Rover, moving much faster than was safe on our rural roads. I finished my row, shut down the harvester, and calmly walked to meet them. The look on Stephanie's face when the officer said, "Ma'am, it appears you were blocking a legal easement," was worth every penny of what was about to become the most expensive legal battle of my life. She actually screamed, "Do you have any idea who I am?" Which, as it turns out, was exactly the wrong question to ask in a town where family names go back centuries, not Instagram followers. The lawsuit landed on my doorstep 3 days later, a thick document filled with legal terms and damages claims that made my head spin. Stephanie was suing me for the full value of her Porsche. Apparently it was a limited edition. Emotional distress, punitive damages, and legal fees. The total came to more than $300,000, several times what my farm generated in a good year. I took the paperwork directly to Frank Wilson, who whistled low when he saw the figure. "She's going for the jugular," he said, flipping through the pages. "But don't panic yet. We have a strong counterclaim here based on the easement interference, harassment, and crop damage." By the end of the week, Frank had filed our countersuit, claiming damages for the intentional blocking of the easement, the previous irrigation damage, harassment, and the crop losses incurred as a result of Stephanie's actions. What neither of us expected was how quickly the story would spread. It started locally. The Blackstone Hollow Gazette ran a front-page article with the provocative headline, "Farm versus Fashion, Local Land Dispute Turns Destructive." But within days, larger regional papers picked it up, and then, somehow, the story went viral online. The narrative split predictably along rural-urban lines. City commenters decried the destruction of private property and painted me as a backward rural stereotype, while farming communities across the country rallied to my defense, sharing similar stories of encroachment and conflict with wealthy transplants. The hashtag #StandWithThompsonFarm started trending, and suddenly my quiet legal dispute was becoming a symbol of something much larger. The community response was overwhelming. A local tech-savvy farmer's son set up a crowdfunding page to help with my legal expenses, and within a week it had raised over $50,000 from supporters nationwide. The local farm bureau issued a statement of support. Even the county commissioners, who'd been so charmed by Stephanie's parties, began to distance themselves publicly from the dispute, issuing carefully worded statements about respecting agricultural heritage and balancing progress with tradition. The pressure seemed to be getting to Stephanie as well. She was spotted having heated arguments with her attorneys in the parking lot of the courthouse, and her once frequent social media posts about country living had abruptly ceased. The discovery phase of the lawsuit revealed the first hints that there might be more to Stephanie's story than simple entitlement. Frank Wilson, digging into her background with the thoroughness of a man half his age, uncovered a pattern of similar property disputes in Stephanie's past. "She's done this before," he told me one afternoon, spreading documents across his cluttered desk. "3 times that I can find records of. Always the same pattern. Move into a new area, make friends with local officials, then start property disputes with neighbors that usually end with her acquiring more land at below market prices. One case in Connecticut had been settled out of court with a confidentiality agreement, but Frank managed to find tax records showing that Stephanie had somehow acquired 2 adjacent properties shortly afterward at suspiciously low valuations. But the real bombshell came from an unexpected source. Stephanie's ex-husband, a financial advisor named David Keller, reached out to Frank after seeing the news coverage. "I can't say much because of our divorce settlement," he wrote in his initial email, "but you should look closely at how she finances these property acquisitions. There's a reason we're no longer married, and it involves ethical boundaries I wasn't willing to cross." Following this cryptic lead, Frank hired a forensic accountant who specialized in real estate transactions to examine public records of Stephanie's property dealings. What they found was stunning: a consistent pattern of manipulated surveys, boundary disputes, and eventual property acquisitions that looked very much like a systematic land grab scheme. As our court date approached, tensions in Blackstone Hollow reached new heights. Stephanie seemed to sense that public opinion was turning against her and attempted to salvage her reputation with a large donation to the county fair fund and a hastily organized farm appreciation event at her property. Few local farmers attended. Meanwhile, our legal team continued to build our case, gathering affidavits from neighbors about the historical use of the barn access path and documenting every interaction we'd had with Stephanie since her arrival. The day before our first scheduled court appearance, Frank called with excitement in his voice. "We've got something big," he said, "really big. The County Historical Society just found the original survey maps from when your grandfather subdivided the property. And guess what? Not only does it confirm the easement, but the actual property line is 3 feet further onto Keller's property than even you thought. Your family has technically owned more land all along." When we finally had our day in court, Stephanie arrived in what seemed like a deliberately understated outfit, her usual designer clothes replaced with a conservative suit and minimal jewelry. Her legal team, however, was anything but understated. 4 attorneys from a prestigious city firm, armed with multiple briefcases and tablets. Our side was just Frank, myself, and the forensic accountant he'd hired. Judge Harrison, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd grown up on a dairy farm herself, began the proceedings by announcing she'd reviewed all submitted documentation extensively and had several concerns about the survey discrepancies that had initiated the dispute. "Your Honor, we've uncovered a pattern," my attorney said, projecting documents onto the courtroom screen. "Ms. Keller has falsified property records in 3 different counties before coming to Blackstone Hollow." The gasp from Stephanie was audible across the room, but the real bombshell was still coming. The one that would turn this entire case upside down and reveal who Stephanie Keller really was. The revelation came during the second day of hearings, when our forensic accountant took the stand. With methodical precision, he laid out a damning trail of evidence. Stephanie Keller had been engaged in what amounted to a sophisticated land fraud scheme for the past 8 years. Using her wealth and social connections, she would target properties with development potential, purchase adjacent land, create boundary disputes through manipulated surveys, and then either force sales or acquire additional land through legal intimidation. The most shocking evidence was a series of text messages between Stephanie and a high-end property developer, obtained during discovery from her business records. "Once we squeeze out the dirt, farmer, we can break ground by spring," she had written just 3 weeks after moving to Blackstone Hollow. Their plan, it seemed, was to acquire my farm and several adjacent properties to build what they called a boutique farm-to-table experience resort, catering to wealthy urbanites seeking authentic rural experiences. Judge Harrison's expression grew increasingly stern as the evidence mounted. Stephanie's attorneys attempted to object repeatedly, but the documentation was too thorough, the pattern too clear. The final piece of evidence was perhaps the most damning. Records showing that Stephanie had made a substantial consulting payment to a junior county clerk who had access to property records shortly before her survey was filed. The clerk, when questioned, admitted to altering historical boundary markers in the digital records system. in exchange for what he claimed he thought was legitimate consulting work. Stephanie's face, which had maintained a composed mask throughout most of the proceedings, finally crumbled as this last piece of evidence was presented. In a surprising turn, the judge called a recess and summoned both legal teams to her chambers. When court resumed an hour later, Stephanie had a new expression on her face: defeat. Judge Harrison addressed the courtroom directly. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds in favor of the defendant, Grant Thompson, on all counts. The counterclaim for harassment, property damage, easement interference, and crop loss is upheld. Furthermore, the court orders the immediate restoration of the original property boundaries as documented in the 1953 deed and survey, which will include approximately 3 additional acres of land that rightfully belongs to the Thompson farm. The financial settlement was more than I could have hoped for. Stephanie was ordered to pay treble damages for the crop losses, full restoration costs for the damaged irrigation system, and all my legal fees. The decorative stone wall was to be removed within 30 days, at her expense. The judge also referred the case of the altered county records to the district attorney for potential criminal charges. But perhaps the most satisfying part of the ruling was Judge Harrison's closing remarks. This court views Ms. Keller's actions as a deliberate attempt to undermine the agricultural heritage and livelihood of a multi-generational farming family through deceptive and potentially illegal means. Such actions not only harm individuals, but threaten the fabric of rural communities. The court strongly condemns this behavior. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered for comments. Stephanie slipped out a side door, her legal team forming a protective barrier around her as they rushed to a waiting SUV. I stood on the main steps with Frank, Tyler, and many of the neighbors who had supported us throughout the ordeal. "I'm just grateful for the truth coming out," I told the assembled cameras. "Farming isn't just a business. It's a way of life. It's about honesty, hard work, and respect for the land and your neighbors. I'm thankful the court recognized that today." The Blackstone Hollow Gazette ran a front-page story the next day with the headline, "Justice Harvested. Thompson Farm Vindicated in Land Dispute." The aftermath unfolded quickly. Within 2 weeks, Stephanie's property was quietly listed for sale, well below market value. The district attorney announced an investigation into the county records tampering. 3 of Stephanie's previous property disputes were reopened for review by authorities in other states. Most surprisingly, I received a handwritten letter from David Keller, Stephanie's ex-husband, thanking me for having the courage to stand up where I failed to. It turns out he had suspected her unethical land dealings during their marriage, but had been silenced by their divorce agreement. My actions had finally brought to light what he couldn't. With the settlement money, we were able to make long overdue improvements to the farm. We modernized our irrigation system, replaced the harvester that had suffered some damage in the Porsche incident, and even added solar panels to reduce our electricity costs. Most importantly, I formally added Tyler to the farm's deed, making him a full partner in the operation. His interest in agricultural law, sparked by our legal battle, had developed into a serious career consideration. He decided to apply to colleges with programs in both agriculture and pre-law, with the goal of helping other family farms navigate the increasingly complex legal landscape they faced. Today, there's a new family in Stephanie's old house. A month later, Tyler and I rebuilt Grandpa's old gate. This time, we carved into the beam, "Entitlement stops here." It's the first thing visitors see, and the last thing Stephanie would have expected. They're actually farmers themselves, a young couple from upstate with 2 kids who wanted land to grow lavender. They asked permission before planting trees near our property line. Sometimes they bring us homemade bread. The property line is now clearly marked with survey stakes and friendly signs rather than imposing walls. Our relationship is what neighboring should be: respectful, cooperative, and mutually beneficial. The additional 3 acres that were rightfully ours all along have been planted with a special crop of heirloom vegetables, with profits dedicated to a legal defense fund for family farms facing similar disputes. That white Porsche? It's still sitting at Earl's Body Shop in town. Turns out Porsche parts take a long time to ship to rural Pennsylvania, and somehow they keep getting the order wrong. Earl says it'll be fixed any day now. Been saying that for 8 months. As for me and Tyler, we're doing just fine. The property line battle revealed we actually owned 3 more acres than we thought. Land my grandfather had never fully claimed. Sometimes standing your ground isn't about being stubborn. It's about protecting what matters, whatever the cost. Even if that cost happens to be one very expensive German sports car. Thanks for listening to my story. If you ever find yourself driving through Blackstone Hollow, honk if you see our sign. Thompson and Son Family Farm, where we grow food, family, and justice, but never entitlement.